Hey everyone, Brendan Sander here. How are you? Thank you so much for joining me and welcome to Top 10 Albums That Changed My Life. So these albums here, they're very personal to me. A lot of these are the way that I discovered my favorite bands, and it's also the way that I discovered some of my all-time favorite albums. But the thing is, it's really about the stories behind these albums. It's the nostalgia. It's what makes these albums hold a special place in my heart and ultimately becoming albums that changed my life. And so I'm going to run through 10 of these here with you. But before we get started, if you're new to my channel and you haven't already hit the subscribe button, please do. Also leave a comment, hit like. All those things help support my channel. I would greatly appreciate it. And of course, as an added bonus, by turning on notifications, you're going to stay up to date on really cool videos just like this with top 10 albums that changed my life. And so I do want to preference this as we get started with it, that the albums that affected me might not be the ones that affect you, and it's all going to have to do with when you came up in music. So if you're surprised to not see one of your favorite bands on here, that doesn't mean I don't like them. It just means that these are the first albums that affected me, and that's kind of how I was approaching this anyway. All right, so kicking off at number 10, Poison, Open Up and Say Ah, from 1988, second studio album from the group. In my opinion, it's just one of the all-time definitive glam metal albums. It's a feel-good party album from start to finish. Even with the ballad that's on here, Ivory Rose Has Its Thorn, it's still a feel-good party album in my opinion, and has ultimately sold 5 million copies in the US. Now in 1988, I was 12 years old, and I had a friend that lived down the street, and we used to hang out and play on his driveway and in the garage and stuff, and I remember him playing this cassette over and over and over down there. And the funny thing was, the song that I liked the best on it was Tearing Down the Walls, which was not a single, not something on the radio and so forth. I mean, out of the sheer magnitude of what this album was, and it's 4 big singles, there was another song that was on the album that I liked even more. But it's that memory and that coming up with that album and hearing it that would ultimately lead to what would become my favorite Poison album, Flesh and Blood from 1990. So while this was my first experience with Poison, it's a later album that would become my favorite. So I'm going to try and point that out on a number of these here, whether or not it's still a favorite or it's one that led to it or so forth. Okay, coming in at number 9, ZZ Top, Afterburner. The reason I'm wearing the shirt, big fan of ZZ Top. 1985, their 9th studio album, second one in the trilogy of albums where they were sort of modernizing their sound using drum machines, drum loops, and synthesizer and all that sort of stuff. And this album here, I mean, whoa, the synthesizers galore on it. And let's see, so the album itself would sell 5 million copies. I mean, it was a huge, huge album for them, even though none of the singles that are on this thing have really stuck around the way that Eliminator, did. Those singles that came off of that are still played everywhere. In 1985, I was 9 years old, and I didn't get into this, though, I would say, until like 1989. So I was a bit older at 13, and I bought this on cassette after listening to my brother's cassette a lot. So it was one of those things where I was really exposed to this album through my brother, and because I liked that cassette so much, I ended up picking this up here and having those good memories that, something that comes from the older brother that's handed down, that kind of a thing. But ultimately, in 1989, 1 year before they would put out Recycler, and then that would be my first ZZ Top album that was, kind of my own. It was the thing that wasn't the hand-me-down. It wasn't the thing that I found from a brother. It was something that was, here was a brand new one, and I was all geared up for it. So this album, Afterburner, it actually led to what is my favorite ZZ Top album, Recycler. Okay, now number 8 and number 7 go hand in hand. So I'm going to talk about them together. Coming in, though, at number 8 on the list, Twisted Sister, Stay Hungry from 1984, their 3rd studio album. And then what will be number 7, Quiet Riot, Metal Health from 1983, and it was their 3rd studio album. So Twisted Sisters, this one would sell 3 million, and this one here, was big news at the time because it would ultimately sell 6 million and was the first metal album to climb its way all the way up the charts to number 1. So pretty cool stuff there with those and the achievements that even both of them were able to do. The Twisted Sister one has a little bit different story behind it in that I saw the band make a cameo in the movie Pee-wee's Big Adventure in 1985. And so in 1985, I would have been 9 years old. And at that point, I was borrowing the cassette from my older brother and ultimately traded him something for it. And at the same time, I was also borrowing this cassette. So I'm borrowing both of these cassettes at the same time. So for whatever reason, I guess because of that, these two albums are locked together for me. If I think of Quiet Riot and Mental Health, I think of Twisted Sister, Stay Hungry. But those two together, and ultimately trading something to my brother, and I got both of these cassettes, and they would impact even greater later on when I would get my driver's license at 16. These were the two albums that I played relentlessly with the windows rolled down, driving down the road. They just became ultimate driving albums for me. And to this day, I love having those in the car and listening to those. They're just perfect in that regard. Now, the other thing about Quiet Riot is that they actually exposed me to the band Slade for their cover of Come On Feel the Noise, and of course other covers that they would do over the years with Mama We're All Crazy Now and stuff like that. So it's kind of cool the way that these different bands have different impacts and what they mean and so forth, but it's always cool when another band turns you on to, or a band turns you on to another one and so forth, like Quiet Riot did with that and so forth. Now with both of these, with Twisted Sister, my actual favorite album is Love Is for Suckers from 1987. That might just be simply because it was much more in the glam metal style that I was into at the time, as to why maybe that one would take on that kind of a feel for me. As far as this one has remained my all-time favorite Quiet Riot album, and still my go-to for that band. All right, coming in at number 6, Judas Priest, Painkiller from 1990, 12th studio album. This was the first one that the band recorded after they had been taken or put on trial for the suicide of 2 teens, as they said that there was backwards messages in their album Stained Class from 1978. Needless to say, the band was not prosecuted or not, didn't go to jail for it or whatever kind of a thing, and I think ultimately was dismissed and stuff like that. But I remember hearing so much about that at the time in the music press and everything, that when this album finally did come out, I was sort of all ears as to who is Judas Priest and so forth. And the album itself would ultimately go on to sell 500,000 copies in the US. And in 1990, I was 14 years old, so young teen. This was prime music for me. But the thing that I think is key about this was it was the heaviest thing that I was listening to at the time. I would not gotten into metal to this degree. But it still had plenty of melody, and I think that's what brought me over to it. But ultimately, I say that this one changed my life because it caused me to begin exploring even heavier music, getting out of the melodic rock, AOR, and glam metal, and moving into heavier metal, and eventually stuff like thrash metal and speed metal and stuff like that. So this album here remains my favorite, but it's that album that I see as the kicker, the album that took me off in an entirely new direction, and always will be thankful to Judas Priest for that. Okay, coming in at number 5, Pink Floyd, Division Bell from 1994, their 14th studio album. 3 million copies would be sold in the US. And in 1994, I was 18 years old, and I'd already purchased Dark Side of the Moon. So I owned a Pink Floyd album. I had bought the 20th anniversary edition of it, which actually came out, I believe, in 1992, technically 1 year earlier, but I know sometimes they do that when counting the 20-year mark of something or whatever. But I had picked that up, so I had that, and I remember buying it simply because it was just one of those albums you hear about all the time, and I had to understand what this thing was. And I enjoyed that, and it was good. But it wasn't until this album came out that I really, really became the huge Pink Floyd fan that I am. But it was all because of the way that they announced this album. It was such a big event when it took place. Radio stations promoted the announcement. It was broadcast live on the radio. I remember pulling over on the side of the road when it was happening, because I think I was on my way to work or leaving work. I can't remember, but it was just like, I have to tune in for this thing. I have to be present. The band had rented out an airship and painted it to look like a fish, and it flew around London promoting the whole thing. They, had done a special thing like on an aircraft carrier or something like that. So it was just a really big, monumentous event that took place, and that was my first time experiencing anything like that. And I didn't really understand the size of a band that Pink Floyd was and how big of a deal it was. Now looking back, I totally get it, but that just impacted me even more. And when I heard the first single, which they played right after that event, was Keep Talking, at least in the US, that was the first single. I think it might not have been the case in the UK and stuff like that, but it changed my life. Suddenly, this new world of melodic rock, prog rock, that it was, and the playing of David Gilmour, and I now, count him as my favorite all-time guitarist, all stems from this album here, and it still remains to be my favorite Pink Floyd era album. Of the earlier stuff, though, before and with, Roger Waters on it, I do count Animals as my favorite, but my all-time still this album here. Okay, coming in at number 4, Journey, Frontiers from 1983, their 8th studio album, and ultimately selling 6 million copies in the US. Now, in 1983, I would have been 6 years old, but so not that I necessarily could have understood that much of what was going on, but my older brothers were playing this on vinyl, and I still have their copy. So if either of my older brothers are wondering what the heck happened to it, I got it. It's in my collection now. But of course, I have the remastered one there on CD. But I just grew up hearing them play it. And I remember years later when knowing a little more about Journey and stuff like that. And this album cover was burned into my brain. So when I was buying my first Journey album and thinking about it and stuff, I remember this, a futuristic look of that. And the song that I always asked my older brother to play for me was Chain Reaction off of this album. And to this day, I still love that song. But years later, looking back at this, I think the reason that I now love it so much is not just the nostalgia aspect of it, but it's actually that it's their hardest rockin' album. Some of their stuff I feel is too mellow. Not that I don't like it, but it's more on that side of things. Whereas this one here was a very hard rockin' album. And so very easy to get into and bridge the gap from the other stuff that I was listening to. And then from there, I could go back into the rest of Journey, and Journey in and of itself, opening me up to much more melodic rock and air war type music and stuff. And so I definitely attribute Journey to that. And one of the reasons that I say that they changed my life. But this album here to this day still remains my favorite. All right, coming in at number 3, Def Leppard Pyromania from 1983. 3rd studio album from them. First to feature Phil Collen on guitar, and I think it was actually him coming into the group that sort of changed the tide for me and why I like the band so much. A lot of people think, no, it's those first 2 albums that are better than anything else, but I like it from album 3 on best. 10 million copies sold in the US. This album was huge. Of course, they would blow it away even bigger later on with Hysteria. But in 1987, my brother gave me his old Walkman cassette player. And along with it, he gave me this on cassette, or at least let me borrow it. I don't think he gave it to me physically at the time. But I used to sit around and listen to this, just tuned in, not knowing what the heck this stuff was, but loving it. And short time thereafter, of course, because this is 1987, the band drops Hysteria. And I even remember back to this day, because knowing that the album came out in 1983 and it was 1987, and asking my brother whether or not the band even existed anymore. And he said, oh yeah, they're still around. But that was a lifetime back then, 3-4 years between albums. But when they dropped Hysteria, again, I was primed for it. So that became my album. This was still my brother's album. Hysteria, drops the song Women, and I was tuned in for that. I was a fan of them right from the start with that, even though the album didn't really break until 3 or 4 singles later with Pour Some Sugar on Me, but ultimately loving it out of the gate. And so 1987's Hysteria is my favorite Def Leppard album. Sorry those of you that love the Pyromania. It did start me on the trend, but it's ultimately Hysteria that I will go back to time and time again. You know, a lot of these albums are ones that I would say are the ones I would take with me to a desert island. Hysteria is always that one that I list as part of that. Including this next one here, in fact. Coming in at number 2, Guns N' Roses' Appetite for Destruction from 1987, their debut album, going on to sell 18 million copies in the US. This was the first band that was my own. This was not one of my older brother's bands. It wasn't somebody that they were listening to, that they turned me on to. This is me now listening to radio on my own, having this band come on with Welcome to the Jungle. I remember hearing them in a battle of the bands kind of a thing where the radio station would pair them up with somebody else, and they kept winning night after night after night. Everybody kept picking Welcome to the Jungle as the winning track, and I remember loving that and rooting for it and so forth. But it was my band. So probably one of the reasons that I made a big connection with this group early on, but it was also the graphic lyrics about sex and drugs. I mean, this album and the band seemed so dangerous at the time. Of course, you look back at it now and maybe not so much by comparison to what's going on these days, but it was a big deal at that time. And I remember really having to talk my mom into letting me buy it. She did not want to let me get it because there were so many articles and things written on just how bad and dangerous this band was, and it was, you know, corrupting the teens and all of that sort of stuff. But ultimately, I was able to talk my mom into it because I was doing well in school and everything else. And so I sort of said, well, you know, let me listen to it as long as I don't change. Is it okay if I have the album? That's kind of how I got her over the hurdle on it. And to this day, this is still my favorite Guns N' Roses album, and always goes down as my favorite rock album too. Okay, now my number 1 album that changed my life goes to Motley Crue, Dr. Feelgood, 1989, their 5th studio album, 6 million copies sold in the US. And this was another band that was mine. This wasn't one where growing up I remember my brothers ever talking about Motley Crue. Even though they had their first album out in 1981, you know, 4 albums prior to this stuff, it just wasn't a band that either they were into or that they owned anything on, and or one that I ever picked up on. I don't know what, but when Dr. Feelgood dropped, and the single itself, I remember thinking, who is this band? I mean, they looked so cool. That music was heavy. It was awesome. You know, part of the culmination of the glam metal movement and stuff like that. But this was also a band that I bought with my own money, and it was the first thing like that. Well, I had to talk my mom into letting me buy that Guns N' Roses album, and I think that was around late 87 or 88 kind of a thing. I still wasn't doing everything 100% on my own. I had to be driven to a record store, all this sort of stuff. I ultimately walked myself to a record store, had my own money. I didn't have to ask for permission on anything, and I bought this album in 1989. And I remember doing that and getting home and listening to it, and it being my own thing that I picked out with no influence of anything else. And from that point forward, I was probably buying a new cassette almost every week. It was just that turning point for me that I had done this, and I decided I want more music. And this is the album that did that, that kicked it off. And here we are, 11,000 CDs later from my huge collection of stuff, and it all goes back to buying this first one here. So there you go. That is top 10 albums that changed my life and the stories behind them, and you can understand the sort of nostalgia and all those sort of things as to why they did that for me. But ultimately, I love these albums. They still hold that special place in my heart. A lot of these are still my favorites of the band and or led to another great album. So check back every Tuesday. I'm trying to do a new top 10 video every Tuesday. So check back if you're enjoying these and see other new episodes. All right, everyone, take care. Have a good one, and I'll talk to you soon. Bye-bye.